Okay, the last element I want to add now is a button element. Buttons are important throughout most website designs as they encourage users to click on something and encourage users to perform an action. And a lot of websites tend to have buttons in them. So let's also style our button. All right, in order to style this button element, we should give it a different background color. This blue won't really fit into our design. Let's find a color which stands a bit out better than this blue and which looks nicer. So in order to do that, let's go back to the Material UI color palette. We talked about that in an earlier video on colors. And I want something bright, something that stands out. For me personally, I like the deep orange color here. So I think that could be a well-suited color for our button. As you can see, Material recommends using a white font on that deep orange, and we can take a look at the accessibility. And here, this primary color, this is the color we're talking about. So they recommend using white text. And if you use a darker color, also white text. Whereas on a lighter version of that orange, we should use black text. All right, keeping that in mind, let's copy over this hex code and go back to the button element. And in order to give that button element some styling, unfortunately, there's again no all button class similar to the text block element above, but instead we have to give it a class. As you can see, the only option here is selecting all links. That's because buttons themselves contain links, and we can style all HTML links with Webflow. However, we want to style the button in itself. And as you can see, right now it appears we have already do have a button class, and that is from the experiments we did earlier. However, I deleted all the elements, the classes remained. Let's just quickly go about deleting all the unused classes and then give this element a button. So if I hit clean up here in the style manager, the three droplets, it's going to basically remove all the classes which aren't in use anymore. And since we have deleted all the elements from our previous tutorials in which we did some experimentations, we can now remove all the classes safely. And the only styles which are still in use are the ones we just added to the style manager. Let's add a button class and give this button a background color of this orange. And I'm also gonna save that color into my palette. I'm gonna call this primary orange and create that. That makes it easier for us if you want to later on reuse that color in our design and don't always have to look up the hex code. Now that button element already looks better. Now the button in itself is supposed to be a bit attention grabbing, and for that I find it slightly too small. So let's make that button a bit bigger. In order to do so, let's increase the font size slightly, give it a font of 16 pixels, which makes the text a bit bigger. We increase the font height to 24 pixels and also change the weight of the font. Now, right now it's 400. If you change it to 500, it's just gonna look a tiny bit bolder. That improves the settings already. So if we give it a bit more padding, we can make the button look a bit longer, and we can just ever so slightly increase its size. And there we go. Now with design, it's always a lot of trial and error, and we really have to continuously adapt your elements until you're really happy with that. Especially once you start out designing your web page, you need to develop a bit of a feeling for these different elements, and there's nothing you can do besides trial and error and really start experimenting with the different elements in order to get around that. It would be nice if the button in itself is slightly interactive. So in order to encourage the user to really click on the button should change behavior once the user hovers over it. And one of the really cool features in Webflow is that we can change this behavior extremely easy. I've selected the button, and the class is here button, as you can see in the settings. And right next to the class settings, I can select a little downward arrow. And here we can change the different states this element can be in. And one of the states is called hover. Let's select that. And then we scroll down to the bottom to the effects section. And here we can transform this button. So we could, for example, make the button grow. Let's exactly do that. I select transforms, and then I select scale, and I want it to scale up ever so slightly. How about 10%? So if the user scrolls over it, the button is supposed to grow by 10%. That shows some interaction to the user. We could also change the background color to a slightly darker orange, for example. Now let's go back to the material UI. And here we have different versions of our color we selected. So we could, for example, make the button appear in this darker orange. Let's try this out. We select the color and go back to our design. And in the color settings, I'm just going to change the color to a darker version. Add it to our palette as well. Okay. And now let's take a look at how this looks like. So if we hover over the button, it changes color and grows slightly bigger. However, if we can see, the changes happens extremely fast, and that makes one almost feel a bit sick looking at that. So let's go about and changing that. I'm going to go back to the button. The button is selected. And importantly, the state I've selected is none. That's important. And now if you scroll to the bottom again, and we can go to transitions, and that allows us to change the transitions between, like, when a user hovers over it. Here I'm going to select type and transform and set it to 500 milliseconds. And that makes a change of the growth a bit more smooth. It happens over a time of half a second. The same for the transition. Add the background color change, and we set that also to 500 milliseconds. So there we go. It's a bit nicer to look at. There we go. We have created our first style guide. Now let's go about actually designing the page. Let's go back to the home page.